At the end of this video, you know how to automate the cleaning of your metadata with Python, so you'll be able to supercharge your Google Sheets activity using Python. I'm going to cover everything you need to know on all the different stages, including setting up the Google Cloud Console, API access, credentials, everything you need to be able to connect your Python code to your Google Sheets. It's going to be really fun, so let's dive in and figure out how to do this now. So the very first stage, you need to head on over to the Google Cloud Console, log in with the Google account you're going to use to access your Google Sheets. And then once you're there, the first step is to create a new project. So it's already quite straightforward. You can notice that I already have a project over here called Spreadsheet Point. But if you want to create your own project, you simply click on this, click on New Project, fill out your details here, click Create, and you'd have that done. This is essential. This is stage one. So make sure you create a project. If you already have one you want to work with, that's fine. But it's also really helpful to organize projects based on what they're doing. So if you're creating a new project for data cleaning, this would be a great place to do it. Once you created the project, the second stage is to enable some APIs. If you're new to using Python or programming, APIs might sound intimidating, but don't be intimidated. All we're going to do is search for a couple of things, click enable. Once we've done that, we're going to be setting up our project with a service account. We're going to be using that essentially with our Python code to be able to connect programmatically to our Google Sheets. So this is kind of like laying the foundations, laying the pipework, laying the pathways. It's really straightforward. There's nothing more to it. You haven't got to do any coding here. You've got to simply enable a couple of things and you'll be all set. So you head on over to the search bar here. Notice I've already got Google Sheets API. If I search for that, I can click on it. Once it loads, you then want to click on enable. This is already enabled for me, so it will show manage, but you just click enable here. That's what it will show. And once it's enabled, you'll have this little message saying it's enabling that. The next stage is to enter the Google Drive API. Same principle applies. Click on it. Once you've clicked on it, wait for the page to load. Click on enable. Once it's enabled, you're all set. And that's it. We've enabled the APIs on the back end for our project and we've ticked that box. Now, the next stage that's important is you need to create a service account and some credentials for that service account. So we click on the little hamburger menu, click on APIs and services, go down to credentials. Once we end up on this page, all we need to do is create a service account. Notice I already have one called tutorials. But if you haven't got one already, you want to create a new one, and you simply click on create credentials here, then click on service account. The new page will populate, give it a name. So in this case, it could be data cleaner, for instance, and then you would click create and continue. You could then click continue and done. We go back to the page, you will see it will take a moment. You can say the new account has been created. It may take a minute to appear. Once it appears, if I refresh the page now, it will show up. And there you go. Data cleaner is now showing. Fantastic. So we have done the next stage, the final stage, to click on our new account. We're going to create a key and download these credentials, and we're going to use this file with our Python code. So we go to keys, we then click on add key and create new key. Okay, then we want it to be in a JSON format. Simply click create. Once we do that, you will then see the download. It shows up here. Once you've downloaded those credentials, the final step I need you to do is to head on over to your downloads directory, grab that file. I want you to move it to the same file you're going to use to store your Python program files and rename that JSON file to credentials.json. Once you've done that, you are set on the back end. Okay, you have created a project, you've enabled APIs, you have created a service account, created some credentials, downloaded those, and renamed them to credentials.json, and you're going to store that file where you're going to store your Python files. And once that's all set, you'll be ready to roll. So the final step now is to get on over to Google Sheets itself and create a new sheet. And we're going to be using this sheet, of course. Now, what you might already have is a sheet that already exists. And in this example, we're going to have a sheet that already exists that has messy data within it. Now, if you don't already have a sheet with messy data and maybe you want to create a new sheet, you're going to import messy data to it, that's fine, however you want to do it. But essentially, you're going to want a sheet which has your messy data within it at some stage. Okay, so what I want to do before I do that is I'm going to head on back to the credentials page. And what we want to do is we want to click and want to copy this email, because we're going to share our Google Sheet with the service account. Okay, so I'm actually going to be using this tutorials service account rather than the data cleaner, but you would click on whatever service account you just created and the credentials file you downloaded it for. Okay, so we've now gone over to Google Sheets. Now I already have a messy data sheet in place. This is, as you can hopefully tell, some of the biggest female artists in music and their tours, and how large those tours were based upon the amount of money that was grossed. And this is a messy data set, and we're going to cover why in a moment. So within this data set, you'll notice there's a whole range of different columns, but what you need to have is a Google Sheet like this. I have named my messy data. I would recommend you following that naming convention purely for the purposes of this tutorial. It needs to have some data within it. So if you haven't got any data, here's what you could do. You could follow along with this example with me, and you can simply head on over to Kaggle. Now, Kaggle is a data science, data analysis website where you can compete and take part in competitions for working with data and learning more about data. And I'd recommend you downloading the Dirty Dataset to practice data cleaning, aptly named. You can simply download this once you're logged in here, and you could then import this CSV file within here. And once you import the CSV file, you will have this exact data set I'm looking at right now. Simple as that, okay? So you want to download that file, import it into this Google Sheet, make sure the Google Sheet's name is messy data, and the final step is to go over to share. And what I want to do is I want to share this with my service account, notice, and I'm going to enter that in there, make sure it's got editor permissions, click share, share anywhere. I've now given my service account access to this, and this is essential because we're going to use that credentials JSON file with our Python code, and our Python code is essentially then going to get access and permissions to work on this Google Sheet, and that's the whole point, right? We want to fetch this data, do some Python magic, and then send it back to the Google Sheet. Okay. Now, one thing I will also point out here, I have two sheets within this. I've got sheet 1 and original. Why have I done that? Well, in essence, what I want to do is have the original data so that we can compare the clean data to the original data. That's all I've done there. You don't need that necessarily, but I've done that just for the purposes of the tutorial. Okay, so we now have our Google Sheets. We have given it access. We have rather granted access to our service account. We're now ready to start thinking about Python, okay? So the first thing, of course, make sure you've got Python installed in your system. I'm sure you've already got that in place, but if not, make sure you install Python. I'm using version 3.10, so follow along with that or greater. And we need to then install some libraries to make sure we are able to do what we want to do in this example. What we need to do is we need to head on over to our, so I'm going to go up a directory and go into data cleaning. And what I need to do is I need to install the following libraries. So it's a pip install command, and I'm going to install gspread, OAuth2 client, and Pandas. And Pandas is a very special library in Python, much beloved by me and any data scientist or data analyst. And we're going to use that library for cleaning our data in this example. So we simply run this command in the terminal to install these libraries, so your Python installation has the libraries it needs to be able to follow along the tutorial and interact with the Google Sheets, etc. Hit enter, requirement satisfied, nothing to see here, but for you it might take a few seconds, so don't panic while it does that. So once you've got that installed, the first thing we now need to do is we need to head on into our coding environment. And within our coding environment, we're going to work on essentially testing our connection to begin with. So we want to check that we can connect to our sheet and make sure everything's working properly. That'll be our test file. And then after that, we're going to work on our actual data cleaning file. If I show you within my directory over here, our list of contents, you'll see I've got my credentials.json file. I've actually got a CSV copy of the data I downloaded from Kaggle. I've got my test file and my clean file. So remember I said you need to make sure you've got a credentials file within the same directory as your Python file. So make sure that file you downloaded is set up just like this. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is head on over to VS Code. So we're going to close that from a previous example, and we are now looking at data cleaning. So first things first, let's look at our test file and let's explain what is going on here. So within this, we are doing some imports. We're importing gspread, we're importing service account credentials, and this is essential. This is how we're going to set up our connection from our Python code to our Google Sheet. Now, if you remember, we were in Google Cloud Console, enabling API, getting a service account, credentials, etc. This is where we're going to use all this information now. So we've got our scope. So what are we doing with this? Well, all right, the scope defines the specific permissions that our script will need to interact with Google Sheets and Google Drive. That's all that is there. Don't overthink it. If you're new to this idea, make sure you copy it exactly as you see here. The next bit is our credentials object, which you can see here. So our credentials object is using this service account credentials import, the from JSON key file name method. We're passing in credentials.json as a string. Notice this is the exact file name. This is actually the path, but because it's in the same directory as my Python files, I can enter it just as this. This is the exact file name. So if you haven't named it credentials.json, make sure this matches whatever you've named it. And we're passing in the scope. This will create a credentials object, which we can then use with gspread's authorize method. So notice I import here, we're going to pass in those credentials, and that's going to create a client for us. And this client is essential because this client is going to allow us to connect to our Google Sheet and perform actions like reading and writing data. So whilst this might seem a little confusing if you're new to programming or Python or working in this way, or new to interacting with anything like this, essentially this is the same step you will always follow. You are creating the scope, you are creating the credentials object, you're using those to create a client. This is your authentication and connection to Google Sheets step. So you can take this to the bank and use this. If you import this at the start, you'll always be able to interact with your Google Sheet. But before you do that, of course, you've got your client. You then need to open the Google Sheets. We're using the open method from the client object. We're going to be passing in the name of our Google Sheet. Remember I said mine was called messy data. If yours is named something differently, ensure that you match it there. Sheet 1, this is the default. Of course, I could put original if I wanted here, but I'm not using that. I'm using sheet 1. And this is then going to create a sheet object. Okay, once we've done that, what we want to do then is fetch the second row. The reason I'm fetching the second row is because the first row is the column headings. I'm going to fetch those values, assign it to this variable, and I'm going to print it out. Once I run this, this is going to verify that I can connect to my Google Sheets. Remember, we did that sharing process. This is verifying that sharing process has worked. The credentials that we've got here allow our Python to communicate with our Google Sheet. Assuming that all works the way that we want, we should then see this printed out to the terminal. So hopefully this will all make sense in the moment when I run this code. So let's dive into the terminal now. I'm over here. I'm going to run Python test. When I hit go, what I hope to see is the first row from that sheet. And there you go, first row of data. So I think you can verify we have connected successfully to our sheet. Everything is in order. We have fetched our data. This print means nothing. This is just a verification step. This testing file is purely to ensure that we can connect to the file. We have the groundwork laid, and now we can work on the rest. Okay, so we know we can connect, we know we can fetch data, but what we want to do, we want to clean the data. That's the purpose of this, right? You have messy data, and we now want to clean it in Python and send it back freshly cleaned to our sheet, so our sheet has the cleanest data that ever existed. That's the whole goal. So we're going to go into our clean file here and have a look at what we've got. So bearing in mind, the top should look familiar. This is exactly what we just did. Remember, this is all the same, so no need to go over this again. This is authenticating, connecting, creating the client, creating sheet object, and then we have our sheet. But what we're doing here, rather than fetching the first row, we're getting all values, okay? And we're assigning that to a data variable. We're then going to get the first row as headers, so that's 0. So zero-based indexing programming is very common, so that gets the headers. So that is the first row, obviously all the column titles. And then the data rows is everything from then on. So we're using slicing within Python. This might be new to you, but essentially what we're doing here is saying from element 1, which is the second index, because of zero-based indexing, up to the very end of the data. I want to assign that to data row. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use pandas. So notice, hopefully the eagle-eyed among you notice we've got one new import, pandas. This is essential. This is what we're going to be doing our data cleaning with. And it's fairly standard practice to import this as PD. So you'll see that time and time again whenever you see any pandas code anywhere. And we're going to create a pandas data frame from this. And data frame is a bit like a spreadsheet. You could think about it as tabular data. So if you think how a spreadsheet's got columns and rows, frame's the same thing, but it's the pandas version of that. So that is a very distilled idea. If you want to learn more about pandas, I'd highly encourage you to do so, because pandas is an excellent way to work on data. So you could supercharge your data analysis by learning more about pandas. But for the purposes of this beginner's tutorial, just assume that we are creating this data frame object using these data rows, and we are assigning the column, let me just undo that, we're assigning the headers as the column values within that. So we're basically saying, give me the column names from the sheet, I'm going to use those as my column names in my data frame, give me the rest of the data, which is the actual data, I'm going to use that as the data to populate my data frame. And once we've done that, we will then have our pandas data frame. And maybe just for the sake of it, before I run the rest of this, I'm going to comment this out, I'm just going to verify to you what that looks like. So if I print that data frame, just quickly to the terminal, show you what this looks like. You should see that this looks almost like a terminal version of the spreadsheet. So let's go over here, let's clear this for a moment, and let's run this. So then what do you see? It's just taking a moment. It's obviously connecting to the spreadsheet and it's fetching the data. You should now look at this, and this looks awfully familiar. We are now looking at a data frame version. Notice it's been truncated. That's only because there's only so much that can fit on the terminal screen. All the data is definitely there. But you can see that this is what the data frame looks like. It looks like the Google Sheet, right? So we now have the Google Sheet within Python, within a pandas data frame, allowing us to work with that data. All right, so let's go back into Visual Studio Code. Let's undo everything I just did, because that was purely for the purposes of this. Okay, so the final stage, we've got our data, we've fetched it, we want to clean it. So I want to remove duplicate rows. So if there's any duplicates, I want those removed. I want to fill any missing values with NA rather than just blanks. And if there's any white space around column headers, I want to strip that as well. So if we go back to our sheet for a moment and have a look, you should see within this there are some duplicates. There's obviously blanks here. If I wanted to, I could add a whole bunch of white space to that. I could add a whole bunch of white space to the start of that. Okay, so what you would expect to see is that stripped out, right? So just for argument's sake, let's just copy this and put it into our original. So I've just made some changes. That's our original. And we know we've got duplicates, we know we've got blanks, and we know I've just added some white space to that column. Okay. So what I expect to see, let's go back to our code. All right. So first of all, I'm using the drop duplicates method or function from the Pandas library, and I'm going to use that with my data frame object. And in place means I want it to work on the data and make the changes directly to the data. So if you didn't put this to true, you'd be creating a copy. But in this instance, that isn't the case. I want to work on it in place, and I want it to be changed. So I'm basically mutating the data that's in my data frame. Following up with that, I'm using the replace function from the Pandas library on my data frame object again, and I'm going to replace any blank strings with NA, and again, in place is true. So hopefully you can read that and it's fairly understandable. It's kind of logical. I'm saying, hey, if there's any duplicates, drop those and do it on the data that's there. And if there's any blanks, replace it with NA, and again, do it with the data that's there. In place is key for this. Now, if you don't want to damage any data, you wouldn't use in place is true. So like with anything, I would highly encourage you to read more about the Pandas documentation to really get your head around how to use it. But because we're working on a copy of data that we've downloaded from our Google Sheet, we're never going to damage that data per se, are we? And what we would also do if we wanted to be extra careful is that we wouldn't write it back to the same sheet, we'd write it back to a different sheet so we could retain our original copy, or we would save a copy to another sheet like I've done. So think about what you need to do, think about what you're happy to change and what you're not happy to change, and just think about what you need to do for your own data. But for the case of this tutorial, I'm making these changes in place to my data frame because I know I have the original data still in my sheet, and I know I have a duplicate of the data in my sheet, so I can't lose any of the original data no matter what happens. And the final bit is that I'm then accessing the columns. So notice here what I'm saying is I want to get the columns, so I'm using the dot accessor. I'm saying give me the columns from my data frame, and then what I want to do is I want to assign to this, convert them to string, and strip any leading white space. So any leading or trailing white space is gone. So what I'm doing here is essentially saying, hey, if there's any white space around any of my column names, strip it away, and then I want to assign that back to my data frame. So I'm kind of doing two things here. I'm assigning to myself. Notice I've got this assignment operator. So if you start on the right first, I'm saying, okay, I've got my data frame, get my columns, I want the string representation of each column, and then I want to strip any white space. What that then does is assign it back to columns. So I'm basically working up in place again. So once that's done, the next bit is to write the clean data back to Google Sheets, as you see here. So I then want to create this variable, which is called clean data, and I'm saying, okay, get my columns, but I want to convert it to a list, and this is going to be a list of strings. So I need to always send a list of data back when I'm using the gspread library here. Okay, and once I've done the same, I'm then saying give me my values, which is everything that isn't a column name, and also convert that to a list. And I'm going to be putting that in as my cleaned data, and that enables me to essentially create my entire set of data. So it would have columns plus data as one big block. So imagine I've used a plus operator here to create one combination of lists because I'm summing two lists. This is list, and I'm summing it. Okay, and then I'm going here and I'm clearing my existing data. I'm using the dot clear method to clear the existing data on my sheet. Again, what I mentioned earlier, be willing to make changes that you know that you're happy with. So I'm happy to clear the sheet because I know I've got a duplicate in my original sheet. And then once that's done, I'm using my update method. I'm passing in my clean data and saying go from cell A1, and that will essentially just populate out from the first cell and fill the sheet with all of my new data. Then a nice little print statement to let me know that it's all worked. Obviously, if there are any errors, they would come up on the terminal. But at this stage, everything should be good to go. So I'm going to resave that. I made some changes, make sure everything's okay. I will go to my terminal and I will simply run Python clean, hit enter, and wait for the magic to happen. So there's a small pause while my Python code is connected to my Google Sheet, fetching the data. Whenever you've made the connection, everything else should happen almost instantaneously. The only delay is that API connection and fetching the data from Google Sheets. So it says it's been successfully done. The only way to verify that is to head on over and have a look. Now, what do we see here? We've got fewer rows, all our duplicates are gone, all of our blanks now show as NA, and look, the blank space at the start here has been removed. And just to prove it, let's have a look at our original. You can see the blank spaces there, you can see that we have duplicate rows, you can see that we've got blanks, but now our data is clean. So we have used Python to very quickly and very efficiently fetch, clean, process, and return our data to our Google Sheet. And that is the power of using something like Pandas, because it is so efficient, so fast, and working on massive data sets to do these kind of repetitive tasks. Data cleaning is one of those things that if you ever work in data is fairly standard and it's there all the time, especially when you're collecting data from various sources. So if you ever found yourself needing to do data cleaning and you've been doing it tediously and manually, Well, now you know you can utilize Python to fetch that data, utilize the Pandas library. And when you dive into the Pandas library, you see just how powerful it is and how efficient it is at doing this type of activity. You'll never want to do it manually again. Pandas can do it for you incredibly efficiently. And it doesn't just work with CSVs, you can work with various data formats and turn those into data frames. But for the purpose of this example, CSV is essentially spreadsheet data is what we're looking at here. We were able to access that by pulling it directly from Google Sheets and then working it within Python and with Pandas. Of course, I could have imported a CSV directly into my Python code as well. But for this tutorial, we're talking about working with Google Sheets, an existing sheet with data. Let's tweak that data, then let's send it back to our Google Sheet so our Google Sheet gets the upgraded data completely free. There you go, you've now learned how to fetch messy data from a Google Sheet, clean it in Python by using Pandas, and then send it straight back to your Google Sheet so it is good as new. This process, of course, can be customized for various data cleaning tasks, and you can also automate it for recurring flows if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of what you can do with Python. But this is a framework to get you started on how you can clean data from Google Sheet using Python. Of course, the opportunities here and the possibilities are endless. It is a big field. There are a lot of things that you can do, especially when it comes to data cleaning. There is so much information out there, especially when it comes to Pandas as well. It is a rich, incredibly powerful library. And when you start to whet your appetite and realize what you can do with it, maybe you've got simple cleaning tasks to do and this is all you ever need. But if there's even more that you want to do, you can start making operations within Pandas as well. You might find yourself taking data from Google Sheets and doing even more in Python and Pandas, dare I say. I hope you found this video helpful. Of course, you need to know more about Google Sheets and working with Google Sheets. Spreadsheet Point has a whole host of resources, especially when it comes to formatting, templates, things of that nature. I hope you found some value in this. Have fun playing with Pandas and Python. Thanks for watching. Feel free to let us know what you think in the comment, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.